We started these programs, these morning after programs in 2000, and the thinking was that there's a group of people, certainly people who work here and others who follow politics and care about it. In the morning after a primary or an election, we'd all be standing around our desks or around a coffee pot talking about what happened. And maybe it'd be a good idea to just have it in a more comfortable room where we could sit down and have some people come in and who were really knowledgeable about these subjects and assess what happened in the election, since we'd be talking about it anyway. This particular one, we'd probably be all talking about the Senate Intelligence Committee if we weren't here, but that's one of the realities of the gubernatorial race, the state races in New Jersey this year, is the competing for attention with all that's going on in Washington and around Washington, and I'm sure that's something we'll talk about as we go on here this morning. I want to introduce our four guests here, and we'll just start in with opening comments from them and then see where the discussion goes. Far end, Roger Bodman is a senior partner with Public Strategies and a Republican strategist and a former member of the Cabinet and the Kane administration's Commissioner of Transportation. Millie Silva, who is Executive Vice President of 1199 SEIU and is in the very small group of people who have run for Lieutenant Governor of New Jersey, which she did 4 years ago. And Matt Friedman, reporter for Politico in the New Jersey Bureau, and Nick Corasaniti, who is a correspondent for the New York Times. So thank you all for coming. I want to start with Nick, and what's your thoughts about what happened yesterday and what it means?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I was most interested in was how both Murphy and eventually Guadagno would, what they would say in their acceptance speeches, given like you said, we're all thinking about the Senate Intelligence Committee and what goes on in Washington and what Trump does every day, so dominates the political discussion. And both of them addressed it, Murphy obviously more so, and that's kind of what he centered his campaign around, being a check on the Trump administration as much as it is a change from the Christie era. But what I thought was really interesting was how Guadagno positioned herself as a moderate Republican. You know, the Republican Party did win the White House, but everywhere you read, you see this party that's supposedly still in tatters and doesn't know which way to go. She kind of went the opposite of Trump. She said that she would, protect the environment. She believed in climate change. She spoke about protecting same-sex marriage and the LGBTQ community. And what she has to do with no real help from Washington is chart a path of a moderate Republican in an election in the post-Trump era that we haven't really seen yet. So everyone keeps looking at the Democrats and how they're rudderless and they don't have a national leader. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Guadagno tries to run as a moderate Republican. Well, that also doesn't really have a national leader.
Thanks. Matt?
Big takeaway for me was just a reinforcement of how important party machines are in New Jersey. There's this idea nationally that there's this political upheaval in both parties, that there's the progressive Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and what happened with Trump in the Republican Party. But if you look at the primary results here, it was just status quo all the way. If you have the party line in most counties, there's always often a few exceptions, but when you have the party line in a county, you're bracketed with every local candidate. You look at a ballot in Hudson County where I live, and there's really only one line. There's not even any other candidates running for. I think there was one Democratic candidate for freeholder, and that was it. Otherwise, there's just one line, and then the other Republican and Democratic candidates for governor are on the line by themselves. And so you look through the results, and it's just that worked. You can have progressive candidates, and often when we see a type of rebel type of anti-organization candidate, it's someone who's running for Congress or running for governor, and they're always going for those sort of upper offices. And if you really want a progressive movement or a conservative, sort of Tea Party movement to affect change and actually make a difference in an election, you have to have such superb organizing skills that you have to field candidates for the absolute lowest office, which is county municipal/county committee seats. That's the only way you're actually going to change your county party, how your county party awards the lines to the candidates who will go on to win those bigger offices. And you don't see much of that organizing. When we see those kinds of candidates, like, say, Jim Keedy in 2016 running for Congress, if you look what happened there, like, actually Democrats kind of wanted to award him the lines in places, but he came in late. And so you can see the effect of the lines right there, where Jim Keedy had the Democrat support in Ocean County, but he didn't in Burlington County, and the Democrats had this no-name guy who, his house had just been foreclosed and was going through these bankruptcies and had all these other sorts of problems. He had the Burlington County line. No one knew who he was, but he still won the primary just by being in that place on the ballot. And that's in, some of the weaker Democratic counties in the state. So I think that's the lesson I took away. Party machines in New Jersey still matters. The activists who really want to overthrow the system, I don't think have been paying enough attention to the very, very local seats that they need to actually change the structure of the parties to win.
Thanks. Millie, what did you make of the election?
So I started my day being the 15th voter at my polling site at 7:30 in the morning, and I took note that voter number 13 happened to be a 99-year-old man who had come in with his son and using his cane to make sure that he cast a ballot. And then we spent the evening with 1199 healthcare workers turning out the vote in the South Ward of Newark and making sure that we were talking to people about the importance of the vote and actually hearing people who knew who Phil Murphy was, who understood that there was a primary going on, and that some of those folks came out to vote. And then closed the day, one of my last conversations was with Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter, who actually shared with me the story of how her 18-year-old was able to vote for her for the first time. And so just taking note of, in this primary race, how do we think about turnout and what that means going into the general election, where, as we all know, New Jersey is going to be one of the only 2 states in the country that is going to have a major election in November. At the same time, what I've seen is that the media, and a lot of us perhaps, have been spending a lot of our energy focusing on national politics and what's happening in Washington, D.C., and yet we have a state race, we have a gubernatorial race that's coming up. And so how that plays out, I think, remains to be seen. One of the other things that I thought was interesting is that while, yes, there's sort of a question of money and the role that it plays in politics, the question of the party and the lines, as Matt described, and what it plays in politics here in New Jersey, at the end of the day, all politics are local. And if you take a look at the primary speeches that were given last night and sort of this question of what the conversation is going to look like with regards to property taxes, which is what Kim Guadagno was talking about in her speech, as well as Phil Murphy's speech, where he essentially laid out a platform that spoke to issues affecting working families, whether it's minimum wage, making sure that there are good public schools in place for folks. And I think that we're going to have to see that while we're on the other side of the primary, we have 2 candidates who are running a race to be the highest level elected official in this state. We have national politics where we're looking at what the president and his administration and the GOP and the Democrats are doing, and yet voters are going to likely go to the polls and make their decisions based on who they believe is the candidate that's going to impact and actually, to the positive, what's happening with their pocketbook and the issues that they care about.
Thanks. Roger?
Thank you. Well, first, let me just say I'm delighted to be back here at Eagleton. I see Ruth Mandel back there. Good morning, Ruth, who's the director of the Institute. I taught a class in this very room for 20 years, from 1989 to 2009, on it was simply entitled Political Campaigning. It's ably being taught today, or the last number of years, I should say, by Maggie Moran and Mike Duhame. So I'm delighted to be back. I also am sort of a student of history here, so I'm along with you, John, I think I'm one of the oldest on this panel, for better or for worse. So I look at the history of what's happened in this state over the last years, even prior to my time. And if you really look at it, You know, we go from Democrat to Republican governors. You know, from Governor Hughes back in the 60s to Cahill, Republican, Byrne, Democrat, Kane, Republican, Florio, Democrat, Whitman / Donnie D, Republican, then the kind of curious situation between McGreevey, Cody, Corzine, et cetera, and then, you know, then obviously Christie, Republican. It is, if you will, the Democrats' turn. So is history going to repeat itself or not is one of the major thoughts going through my mind. Millie touched on this. There's a letter out in the lobby there that I would advise all of you to take a look at. It's framed, and it's from a constitutional delegate from the 1947 convention. And he talks about the deliberations that took place in this very building back then and how it was such a wonderful location for them to offer those deliberations. But one of the most unique outcomes that we're all familiar with is the fact that we have elections in the off year. Why do we elect Republicans? The three, in modern times, my former governor, I guess I call him, Governor Kane, I ran his campaign in 1981, both primary and general. Obviously, Governor Christine Todd Whitman, and of course, Governor Christie. Why do we elect Republicans in a state that has 840,000 more registered Democrats than Republicans? It's a state that is, George Will, the conservative columnist, said, is a deep shade of blue. And he's right. You know, why do we do that? Because we hold our elections in the off year. And elections are forward-looking in that sense. In other words, you know, we can, Governor Kane was a very popular governor. He won by 800,000 votes in 1985, the biggest landslide still in the state's history. Yet he was unable to help his successor, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The individual that tried to succeed him, I should say, in the 1989 gubernatorial election. Just a few more things, and I say this with all due respect to my friends from the legislature. New Jersey has kept its perfect record alive of not electing anyone directly from the legislature to the governorship. Ask John Wisniewski, ask Chitterelli, ask Senator Lesniak, and a whole host of others. Governor Kane was, in fact, elected governor 4 years after he left the legislature, and he left the legislature in '77, was elected in '81. Governor McGreevey, who had been a senator, gave up that Senate seat in '97 to run against Whitman, unsuccessfully, close but unsuccessfully, and went on to win 4 years later. So that's another piece of New Jersey political lore for all of you to ponder. Thank you, John.
And we continue to elect to the highest offices in the state people who had never run for office before, which is not for the first time we did, or at least to nominate this time. Talking about turnout, that was a big story going into yesterday. I've had people sort of underbidding each other, guessing how low the turnout was going to be. I guess the estimate is that it was 13% of the eligible voters turnout. That's not that different than what it's been. So it was 19% in 1993, but since then it's been 14 or 12, or in 2009 it was 11%, in 2013 it was 9%. I guess one question is what should have motivated people to vote yesterday? The candidates in each party, at least on issues, didn't seem particularly different from each other. There were personality differences certainly and other factors maybe, but what led, I mean, as opposed to what led people not to vote, what led people to vote, you think? Civic duty?
I think on the Democratic side there was an energy, even a small amount, to get the first opportunity, at least in New Jersey, to respond to the 2016 election. I mean, while it was low on both sides, I think if you combined Wiz and Johnson, they still beat Guadagno. So there was certainly a much bigger turnout on the Democratic side. So I think they were energized, and they feel like they had something more to go on, and that was the opportunity to check what they see as, overreaches or changes in policy, especially, with the news that came a few days before the election that President Trump would pull out of the climate accord. That'll energize plenty of people in this state. That I think that might be, while the turnout was low, that might have been why you saw much more on the Democratic side.
Yeah, Democrats are really chomping at the bit to send a message about Trump, and but in both cases, for the most part, the people who voted in the primary are the people who always vote in the primaries. It's just the absolute most committed voters who vote in every single election. I think if you look at it, 13% is of all registered voters, who obviously all of them, everyone's eligible to vote in the primary if you go to the poll and register with a party that day, even if you're unaffiliated. I think from Patrick Murray's analysis I looked at, it was about 24% turnout with Democrats and 20% Republicans. So that does show you there's a small enthusiasm gap there. I think it will grow as more and more people get engaged. There's maybe more young people because, Phil Murphy wants to legalize marijuana. So I'll be watching to see if there's, a bigger turnout of young people at the election in November. But so far, it's really hard to break through to anybody. One of the problems here in New Jersey that we've become very familiar with over the years is that, so many people still get their news from the TV. And we have New York City television stations and we have Philadelphia television stations, and none of them spend a whole lot of time on our elections. And even our state-dedicated television stations, you have NJTV, which everyone gets, but let's be honest, not many people watch. And
But if you watched it last night, you could have seen the weddings of Downton Abbey.
Right. That's an interesting fact that at Phil Murphy's party, while all the VIPs were in a room where the rest of us were not allowed, for the millionaire who lives in a mansion down the shore. Actually, they were playing NJTV and Downton Abbey was on. And when I mentioned that on Twitter, people were pointing out the dynamics, the not so subtle dynamics of Downton Abbey playing at Phil Murphy's victory party. So.
Hey, Matt, if I could just interrupt. I've done commentary on public television for literally 35 years, and I like to suggest that when my mother passed away, they lost half their audience share.
Yeah, I think Matt's absolutely right, this issue of being stuck between two media markets. And I think that one of the things that it means for anyone who's running for office is that you need to be able to raise the resources to be able to get yourself on TV, right? And so that is going to matter because certainly people then who, in the particular, with this primary race, were perhaps not engaged, it really wasn't until the last couple of weeks of this race where then they were able to see a good number of the candidates actually running their ads. And I think that speaks to the importance of how the ability to continue to raise dollars is going to matter going into the general. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, where certainly on the Democratic side, we now have the nominee agreeing to public financing for the campaign. And so what does that mean in terms of how you're thinking about reaching New Jersey voters? I also think that this question of millennials and how they are going to participate is also something that remains key. And I thought it was interesting that with Kim Godano's speech last night, she made a overt outreach to millennials and young voters, asking them to participate and to get engaged. It will be interesting to see what happens in terms of the ability of her campaign to do that, as well as just sort of taking a look at how do we move forward in this election. So.
Speaking of money, one interesting thing is that, and millennials, a 32-year-old, 33-year-old engineer named Hirsch Singh, who was really, not much of a factor in the Republican primary, wound up kind of getting a surprising 10%, I think, last night, which is, a pretty decent result for someone none of us really batted an eye at. I can't think of any other reason than the fact that his dad gave him $1 million that he used to put ads on TV. It works. It gets you some votes.
He also did some mailings, Matt, because I received one of them. My thoughts on this is there were very few surprises yesterday. I made a joke about public television a minute ago. I did do the commentary along with Bill Kastner on both the debates that NJTV sponsored a couple of weeks back. And both Bill and I made the same point, I think, at both debates, and that is that in primaries, organization support and money matter. And we effectively said, well, the Democrats debating, this primary's over. Murphy's going to win, hands down. He's got all of the support, organization support in the state, and obviously $20 million. That means something. Godano less so, but she had 14, I think, 13 or 14 counties, whereas versus 7 or 8 that 6 or 7 perhaps that Jack had. Yet they were the big counties. They were Ocean. Ocean County she got 60% of the vote. 17,000 to like 6,000, something like that last night. It was huge. She had Monmouth, she had Bergen, she had the big counties. And even in counties where he had the organization line, my home county of Mercer, I live in Hopewell Township in Mercer County, he had the line and she won. And the same was true in Middlesex. So it tells you a little bit, Matt, about that organization support. But really, when it comes down to a sleepy primary, organization support and money matter. And in both cases, the candidates had the most won.
You know, one thing that I would add, though, actually, is that just to contrast a little bit, is Chattarelli ran a campaign where he had, I think it was at least 75,000 voters, right? And to the point around sort of the party support matters, at the same time, the ability to reach out and have conversations with voters in their neighborhoods and in their communities matter, right? And I actually think that you both saw that with his campaign, as well as seeing that with the Murphy campaign, where you saw that there was a very deliberate plan to, yes, have the funding to pay for the campaign, yes, get the organizational support behind the campaign, at the same time run a race where you are taking no vote for granted and really going out and engaging with voters. I don't know how many town hall meetings they had, but certainly, you know, I got the phone calls letting me know that there were town hall meetings, and 1199 members would say, hey, I got the voicemail message, there's a town hall meeting. They were happening up and down the state, and it was a pretty aggressive pace of saying, we're going to do mail, we're going to do phones, we're going to have town hall meetings, we're going to hear people talk about the voters. And I do think that while money matters, organization matters, I also think that you saw at least two campaigns, and I actually think also with the Johnson campaign and with the Wisniewski campaign, that what you also saw is candidates who said, we're not going to take this for granted, and we're going to run a campaign where we're getting out in front of voters. I do think that that's going to be critical going into this election in November.
Let me just say this about Jack Chattarelli. I have been around his business for over 40 years. Totally discounted him as a candidate 8 months ago. Totally. He's a wonderful man. He's smart. He was a backbencher, with all due respect to Jack. He was a backbencher in the minority party in the state legislature. You know, I didn't think he had a snowball's chance, as they say. This guy ran one hell of a campaign. He managed to put together 6 or 7 candidates. He did the town halls. He did all that stuff. You know, the problem is, again, in a statewide race, you know, it's organization support and money. He just didn't have enough of either. You know, but he's got a future ahead of him. He really made a race of it. Then when guys like me that have been watching his business for a very long time didn't think he would ever make a race of it.
Getting back to the media point, I mean, one thing that I thought Murphy did that was really smart, and again, this is probably operating well below the advantage he had from all the county lines and the county operations, but you couldn't access a website in New Jersey without seeing Phil Murphy's face. There was banner ads. There was on Facebook, like, even when I'm in New York.
That's what $20 million will do for you.
Exactly. And online, you really need $1 million, sadly, for the New Jersey websites to really make it go all the way. But I think that's, Trump was so effective in his use of social media, and so was Bernie Sanders. And I think you're starting to see that we clearly haven't reached a tipping point, but in a state like New Jersey that doesn't have its own television media market, it's split between 2 states and has sadly seen its newspaper and print media atrophy so much. Murphy just saw that people were going online, and he literally, I don't think I ever saw a Johnson, Wisniewski, Guadagno ad on any website, on any Facebook thing, and that, if nothing else, certainly elevated his name ID in a race that no one was paying attention to.
The primaries, again, are targeted. It's a family fight. You know, there is as the 20% or the 24%, whatever it was, proves. You know, if you have limited dollars, you're Kim Guadagno. You know, you're certainly not going to have the $20 million that he had, or you're Jack, or you're the other candidates in the Democratic primary. You have to be real careful how you spend your money, and you want to spend it on those that you think are going to vote. The 4 out of 4 voters, as we used to say, that vote in every single primary, regardless whether the assembly is the top of the ticket. All due respect, my friends, or whatever it is. You know. That's the voter that you target, and these targeting stuff. One of the reasons I gave up teaching here, Ruth knows this story, was because the word Twitter. When I heard that, I thought it was a bird in a tree, and therefore I said it's time for the old guy to go. But the point is this micro targeting stuff in the general elections have gotten extraordinarily sophisticated, and even so in the primary. So when you have a limited dollar, you're not going to spend it on banner ads on some website someplace. You might if you think that's targeted to your audience that you think is going to turn out in a Republican primary with a 20% turnout. But you got to be real careful with your money and how you spend it. And these campaigns are so much more sophisticated than the campaign I ran for Governor Kane back in 1981 in both the primary and in general, which is why I suggested to Ruth it's time to get somebody else to teach your campaign course.
I want to turn to issues a little bit. I heard somebody commenting on the election on the radio this morning saying, unfortunately, the press isn't going to talk about issues. We're just going to talk about Trump and Christie and John Corzine, and it seemed something of a self-fulfilling prophecy maybe for a commentator to say that. But we're at a point where pretty much everyone recognizes the state has huge financial problems that don't have anything resembling easy answers. Is it reasonable to expect either or both candidates to have anything resembling specific plans for how they're going to address those things? Or do you think it'll be a more general discussion? And how do any of you see that unfolding, or what would be your advice to the candidates?
Even the specific plans right now, if you go one layer deeper into them, you see how vague they really are. Like Kim Guadagno's plan to cut property taxes. She has a very detailed plan on how people would get property tax relief. What she doesn't have is a plan of how it would be paid for. So it would cost $1.5 billion, and that is going to come from auditing the state government and economic growth. Phil Murphy is also depending on economic growth to fuel. We really don't know whether that's coming or not. I think there's been specific proposals like a public bank, but I don't think we've been really given realistic campaign promises on how Phil Murphy is going to fulfill his pledges to fully fund the pension system, to fully fund the school funding formula, or Kim Guadagno for this quote-unquote circuit breaker on property taxes to actually cut them for the first time, I don't know, ever since I've been doing this job, and probably much longer. So I think we'll probably see pretty vague promises similar to what Governor Christie made in 2009. That doesn't mean it, doesn't translate into action, as we saw, early on in Christie's term. For better or worse, for a lot of people, he took some serious action. Now that tapered off after the first couple years, but things happened. I think Phil Murphy is going to probably have to make some hard choices because he's promised a lot of things to a lot of people. Assuming he wins the election, which obviously is more likely than not, there's going to be some reckoning in Trenton.
And one of the things I thought was most interesting, and this actually goes more to the vagueness, and I think it was you, Matt, who asked him this question, but when Phil Murphy held his transportation unveiling, which was really just like, we're going to fix this, we're going to fix this, we're going to fix this, with no real way of saying to pay it. Someone was like, well, how are you going to pay for it? And he was evasive again, and then he just kept saying possibly and possibly, and someone said, would it be with a new tax? And he was like, possibly. And that was like alarm bells. Everyone was like, so he's going to tax everyone. But I think one of the things that Murphy's done, both through his advantage and disadvantage, is like just keep saying everything's on the table, and that's going to make it harder to pin him down, because if he can just keep saying that, then he can literally kick the can down the road until he's elected. But the thought that he was willingness to also say possibly a tax does show that maybe that actually is how he's going to approach it.
I actually listened closely to the speech that he gave last night, Phil Murphy. And actually, if you take a look at that speech, I actually think that he did speak a bit to some of the specifics in terms of addressing the state finance issues, right? He spoke about he actually did speak about taxes and said that those who are paying, who are earning the highest levels are going to have to pay a little bit more in terms of taxes, which is something that certainly Kim Guadagno was not saying. In contrast, on the question of taxes, her speech was one, as Matt described, where she said she's going to cut property taxes through a state audit, and that's about as specific as she was in her speech. So I heard that. I also heard the importance of ending some of the tax breaks to corporations, and certainly that's going to be some source of revenue. And I also think that it was critical that he spoke to the importance of how you have to grow the tax base and you have to create good jobs, right? Good paying jobs, so that people then actually have additional income to reinvest back into the economy. I heard a speech that spoke to some specifics in terms of addressing the finances, and also a pretty clear agenda and specifics in terms of things that he would want to get done, right? He spoke about how there is legislation or bills that came across Governor Christie's desk that were then vetoed, that he actually would sign into law, whether it was equal pay for equal work for women, whether it was making sure that the minimum wage increases to $15 an hour, as well as meeting the obligation to make the payments on the pension plan for public employees. So I think that there were a fair amount of specifics that I heard on this between both of the top nominees at this point for this election.
You know, I just hearken back to the Democratic debate, and with all, I say this with respect to, due respect to Phil Murphy. I don't remember who exactly said what. There was 4 of them at that debate a couple of weeks back, but they talked about a millionaire's tax, a marijuana tax, New Jersey transit tax, whatever that is. You know, not put, you know, the estate tax that's being phased out would be phased back in, and then they talked about spending programs. You know, as was mentioned here, fully fund the school formula, pre-K. Free, some sort of free higher education, some sort of universal health care program. Again, this wasn't necessarily all Phil. This was this may have been some of the others. I just forget who said what and when. But you know, you're talking literally tens of billions potentially in spending with this stuff. Anyway, so I don't think beyond that we're going to get terribly specific in this race. As to the audit thing, let me just address that. You know, I have some experience with that from when I was in the Governor Kane's cabinet, both as Commissioner of the Department of Labor and later Commissioner of the Department of Transportation. You know, when you use the phrase audit, and all of us think of a financial audit. Okay, we're going to go find some money in a drawer someplace that wasn't, you know. There are, you know, it's more of a at least in part, we did during the Kane years what was a management audit. You know, the governor called it GMIP. We have to have acronyms in government, right? We can't just say Governor's Management Improvement Program. No, we have to say GMIP. Anyway, GMIP was just that, the Management Improvement Program, where we had folks come into the department. When I was labor commissioner, for example, it was 5,000 people in the department in those days. You have no idea how many. You have no organization. There's not some big chart someplace when you become commissioner. Here's how this place is structured. And what we found, by the way, once we did this management audit, was that there was usually you have a manager and 5 or 6 people reporting that individual, and so forth and so on. There was a 1-to-1 management structure. This person reported, that person reported, that person reported, that person reported, that person wasn't, and no one had looked at this stuff in 40 years or perhaps ever. And so when you use the word audit, just don't think money. Think about how the executive branch is structured, because that's the kind of thing that I believe the Lieutenant Governor is talking about.
One other thing on issues that I think will be interesting to look at is, I know we said media always focuses on Trump, so perhaps I'm also self-fulfilling right now. But one thing that Murphy has been pretty adamant about is his environmental stance, and there's things he can do kind of unilaterally, immediately, like you saw Jerry Brown do, Governor Cuomo do in New York, to say we will commit to the Paris Accords and make a bunch of commitments that won't come due immediately under him, so he won't necessarily feel any kind of financial burden, but at the same time he can do immediately, and I think that will satisfy some of the extreme hunger, especially some of the Democratic base is going to show, as Matt mentioned, like the reckoning that will come if and when he wins. You could look at those kind of policies.
Yeah.
But as far as Trump goes, I mean, it's not different from the issues. I mean, there's going to be huge issues in New Jersey coming from the Trump administration. If we pass this health law, then what are we like? Need $800 billion? Is it to pay for the Medicaid? Not billion. I'm sorry. Just, you know, you're drilling off the coast of New Jersey, immigration policy, all these issues, you know, very directly affect New Jerseyans and how they'll vote in this election. So it's, you know, in large part, it's one of the same, and I think we're going to see those issues dominate.
Okay. I want to open the floor to questions from people here, and also if you're online, you can submit questions online, and we'll process some of them. Jeff Laurenti. Yeah, wait for a microphone. So.
Is this on?
You tell me.
Is this on?
Right. Hi, Jeff Laurenti from Trenton. One of the things that we haven't talked about is what I thought was the fairly remarkable, given that he spent $20 million and had 21 county lines, sub 50% turnout for Phil Murphy. And candidates who, outside of their own legislative districts, or in the case of Jim Johnson, with no base at all, together collectively getting more than that. I mean, it's hard to tease out whether it's $20 million or 21 county lines that was more responsible. But it does remind one of Mrs. Clinton's having 54% of the Democratic primary vote nationally last year. That's a canary in the mine shaft. And what might be the weaknesses that Phil carries into this, even with an impressive policy machine and such. The other thing that I would raise is that I had done canvassing in my ward with a targeted voter list, and the median age of these voters was over 65. one wonders whether looking ahead into the future of primary elections, whether we're going to see a vastly collapsing electorate, since these 65-year-olds who've been habituated to vote in primaries are, in the normal course of insurance actuaries' calculations, not going to be there in the next 20 years.
Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, or we can let it stand.
Let me just comment, Jeff. You know, I think this election, you know, you can see where the Lieutenant Governor is going with this, okay? You know, Wall Street versus Main Street. She's starting her Main Street tour versus Wall Street today. She's got a variety of stops today. She's walking with Joe Piscopo in Newark tomorrow. She's going to certain urban centers. She's actually going to a labor union, labor hall someplace, I believe, in Morris County. Anyway, you know, this harkens back to a race that in 2000, I was, my dearest friend for many years, and Barbara knows this, was a former congressman and state legislator, the late Bob Franks. Bob, my wife and I are godparents, two of his daughters. He ran against Corzine in 2000, as many of you remember. Corzine spent $60 million, and Bob spent $6 million. Bob got 47.5% of the vote in that election. There were bumper stickers around the state that said, "Bob, make him spend it all." He almost did, and he almost won. And keep in mind, that was a presidential year. Al Gore running against George W. Bush. Gore won New Jersey by 500,000 votes, plus or minus that year. Corzine won by 80,000. 420,000 people voted for Gore that did not vote for Corzine. Now, you know, Phil Murphy remembers this story, which is, I am assuming, why he smartly is accepting public financing in the general election. You know, the $20 million thing is done and over. Okay, you know, it's still a campaign, opportunity, if you will, for the lieutenant governor. But he's not going to persist, I don't believe, in the sort of the money bags buying the election thing that almost led to Franks' upset win. If that was not a presidential year in 2000, Franks would have been the United States Senator from New Jersey.
You know, Jeff, one other way to look at this is that you actually see that you had on the Democratic side, you had 4 leading contenders who during the course of this primary campaign engaged close to 500,000 New Jerseyans. Right, and so certainly there are significant resources that were spent by Phil Murphy and his campaign, but then when you also then take a look at what both Wisniewski and Johnson and Lesniak were able to do, also again, money spent towards the campaign and engagement with voters. There are 500,000 Democrats who engaged in this process and voted yesterday. On the Republican side, you know, and I suppose we could do the math and sort of figure out what the ratio is in terms of how many people voted to the dollars. And then because on the Republican side, you had less than half, right? You had, I think, 225,000 folks who voted between Guadagno and Chattarelli.
And the other thing that's a small point to that, and Murphy's campaign would say this, is that, you know, look at where we started and where we ended up. 3 years ago, no one knew who the hell Phil Murphy was in New Jersey. And you could say the same with Johnson. And those were the two who spent the most, and they had to start from literally nowhere to get to where they were, and they finished one in a distant second. So I do think that some of the money that he had to spend to get to Phil Murphy being, and it's not exactly a name that sticks out in the mind, which can be hard for name ID. So to get to a point where people kind of know who he is now was way more expensive than it will be, I think, to run with more attention and an already established personality.
It's hard for liberal Democrats to get excited about a guy who made millions of dollars at Goldman Sachs, and but it's hard. But it's not going to be so hard in November because of Donald Trump and Chris Christie, who is just absolutely loathed in this state right now. So. I think the reluctance of Democratic voters will be canceled out by the backlash from Trump. The thing is, though, I think what we saw in the 2004 presidential election, and we saw in the results of Hillary Clinton's loss here, is you really do need often a candidate. Just voting against someone doesn't work. Democrats just voting against Trump didn't work. You need a candidate people actually like and feel strongly about. So that's going to be Murphy's challenge, is to actually make people like him. I mean, what we heard about him early on was John Corzine with a personality. So, but he does have a personality. He can, he's pretty good. His smile can come across as a little forced sometimes, but because I think he smiles too much, to be honest with you. So that's his challenge. He's got to actually get people to vote for him, not just against Trump and Christie.
And I actually think one of the things that is refreshing, and again, sort of thinking about how they ran that campaign, thinking about that speech that he gave last night, it was a speech that spoke to the values that are important. You saw laid out a progressive agenda and went issue by issue in terms of what are the things that he will do on a variety of issues affecting working people, affecting women, affecting just New Jersey voters in the state. And then actually around vision and attitude. It was a positive speech. It was one that was actually asking people to vote on the issues and vote for something as opposed to voting against something, to Matt, your point against. If in November there are folks who engaged in the elections because they were voting against any one of the candidates, actually I think that Phil Murphy is inviting New Jersey voters to vote for values, for a vision that says we need to unite and move New Jersey forward. And I think that people are hungry to vote for something as opposed to voting against someone.
There was I keep talking about historical figures, I apologize, I'm old. I was up with my old boss, Governor Kane, last week, and whom I enjoy spending time with. He's 82 years old and doing very, very well. And one of the things we talked about, we always reminisce about this kind of stuff, was that there were no super PACs when he ran in 1981 and I was his campaign manager. They didn't exist. I suspect one of the reasons Phil is not terribly concerned about taking the public financing, which gives you, what, $13.8 or $14 million or whatever to run a statewide race, that there might be a couple of super PACs floating around out there that's interested in this for both domestic and national political reasons. So, hang on, because I think you'll see an awful lot of that kind of super PAC money in independent expenditures.
And Roger, on that point, I actually think it will be interesting to see, again, sort of thinking about the national component to this, whether the GOP actually puts money into the state of New Jersey to support Kim, or whether she's actually going to run by herself.
That's a very interesting question.
Karen, we need a microphone.
I'm Karen Kessler, and I live in Somerset County. Yet I worked for a Democratic governor that got taken down when he said, I'm raising taxes, and he lived to only see one term. So my question to you is, we heard last night Phil Murphy be fairly clear that he's going to be raising taxes, and we heard a lieutenant governor makes a fairly bold statement that if I don't reduce your property taxes, I'm out of here in one term. So I wanted to ask you how you thought those two issues were going to play out, given that New Jersey has a real tendency to not want to pay more taxes.
That'll actually be one of the hardest things Phil Murphy has to deal with. Like Matt said, he's promised a lot. I was speaking to my colleague Jonathan Martin about this, and he has given the base so much to chew on and want, but he's going to be very hamstrung by both the economy that won't grow and what he's projecting, which is how a lot of these platforms are built. And there's issues that are going to come up, like transportation and infrastructure, that are going to prove critical at a point where it's going to be unforeseen costs. So no one's going to say immediately that they're going to raise taxes. I think the farthest you'll ever see anyone go is what Murphy did when he said possibly. So that'll get him, to the election point. But I don't think anyone will ever promise that they would. If
I can make a comment, Karen, the last Democratic governor to win re-election was Brendan Byrne in 1977. That, ladies and gentlemen, was 40 years ago. 40. There's been 3 Republicans since then that ran and won re-election: Kane, Whitman, and Christie. What does it tell you? It tells you that and I offered some brilliant analysis some years ago after, if I can flatter myself a little bit, after both the Florio election and the Corzine election, after both one-term governors were defeated, and I said something brilliant to the effect that the only time Republicans win in New Jersey is when Democrats screw it up. And there's some truth to that. And I think that's kind of the heart of your question. So the real issue here is how far, assuming Murphy gets elected, how far does he go? Is he another one-term guy? Does he keep that trend alive? And a Republican gets elected, you know.
People respond to her saying, I'm out of here if I don't reduce your property taxes. Is that enough of a big idea that people get enthusiastic?
You know, listen,
I'm asking.
let me just, I'll try to answer your question, but, you know, I pointed out I was in this room for 20 years teaching a class. One of the things we did when I was in this room was show an ad from 1973. Who ran in 1973 for governor? Brendan Byrne, 93 years old now, God bless him. And the ad was of him standing in front of his then home in West Orange, New Jersey, telling the voters how he's going to reduce property taxes. Okay, folks, how many, raise your hand, how many property taxes went down since 1973 in New York? Okay, you know what I'm saying. I was surprised that the lieutenant governor made that comment. I was very surprised, you know. But there's something to be said to being a one-term governor. If you go in there with the ad, I think she's got an uphill climb. We'll talk about that. But let's assume she gets elected for a minute. You know, there's something to be said to go in there without worrying about re-election. There's something to be said to go do the right thing. Don't worry about your polling numbers. Don't worry about running for president. Do your job and do it well, and you know, and get out of there after 4 years. Who knows?
If we're going to talk about ads from 1973, I want to be more current and talk about one from 1977.
I'm your expert on that one too.
Okay, we have on the Eagleton website in the Center of the American Governor an ad that Brendan Byrne used in 1977 that he thinks and was told was that what turned that election around in his favor, where he looks straight at the camera and says, I said 4 years ago I wasn't going to raise taxes. I was wrong. Mm-hmm. And it's a remarkable ad. I recommend it to you. I mean, I don't know how it factors into this election, but just being really straight, literally, in terms of saying what he thought the state needed. And at least at that moment, that resonated with voters.
One quick thing about taxes is we saw an effort to make the gas tax rise an issue in the Republican primary, and if you're going to sense that anywhere, if you're going to see the backlash from a tax hike, it would be in the Republican primary, and I didn't see any of it. Betty Lou DeCroce voted for it. She won, you know, the primary against people who were complaining about her vote for the gas tax. Steve Orho's primary, you know, his real primary opponent never gained any traction, and that was, you know, she was talking about the gas tax. And he's the guy who wrote it. So I didn't sense any anti-tax backlash there. I think people will be skeptical of Guadagno's claim. I think they'll say, well, you've been there for 8 years, and maybe on paper you've slowed the growth of property taxes, but anyone can look at their bills and see how much they've gone up since 2010. So that's her problem, is that she's saddled with everything from the last 8 years, and she can say, well, I've differed from him on this, but all Murphy has to do, well, when did you speak out? Well, never, you know, or at least not until I was laying the groundwork to run. So that's really just a massive, massive obstacle in her way.
I have to agree with Matt. When I looked at and listened to her speech last night, someone wrote with her what she was going to say to New Jersey voters, and what she indicated was that she's going to run on her record, and she said it over and over. I'm running on my values, my principles, my record, and so then we have to, you know, I think it's going to be a significant challenge for her to define and to convince New Jersey voters what is her record, and how would you possibly contrast that from the policies and the decision making of Governor Christie over the last 8 years? And do we want then another 4 years of a Governor Christie administration, which is what would happen if you're going to run on my record, which has been that she's been the number 2 person to the governor. I think it's a significant challenge that she faces in defining herself and defining her campaign moving forward.
We're right there, next to you.
Suzanne Clark, I live in Spotswood. There is a third-party candidate running for governor this year with the Green Party. What do you think Seth Caperdale's chances are, considering that so many Democrats did not vote for Phil Murphy?
It's not going to happen. It never does. There's, you know, Green Party tends to, I think they field candidates every 4 years. And he's got, you know, I've looked at some of his stuff. He's very active in the immigration issues, in defending people from deportation. But this goes back to the party machinery in New Jersey, and once again to ballots. And 8 years ago, there was a very credible campaign and a well-funded campaign run by Chris Daggett. Right, and he was polling up, I think, in the 20s at one point. When it came to election day, he didn't get anywhere near that. When you're a member of one of the major political parties, you have, one of the two top spots on the ballot. When you're running for the Green Party or the Libertarian Party or some of the more established third parties, you're stuck in there with Jeff Boss. So you got Green Party on the ballot, and you may or may not be behind the guy who said the NSA did 9/11 on the ballot. So, that right there, there's a lot of factors, but that right there is just, once again, party machines, big obstacle, just a structural problem with the ballot and voters finding you.
Hey, Matt, back in 2009, I helped both Governor then candidate Christie and Guadagno in their debate preparation. I was literally the stand-in for the debate prep as Chris Daggett. I was his actor. I served in a cabinet with Daggett. Chris is actually a good friend of mine. I was at his wedding. Anyway, he got 140,000 votes in that election back in 2009, which represent about 5%. You're right. He was up in the 15-20% region at one point. He got enough money to get involved with the debates under the public financing scheme. As you know, you raise a certain amount, you get invited to participate in the mandated debates. But when the day is done, 140,000 out of, rough numbers, 2.3 million cast.
Comments? In the back.
Hi, my name is Alex Anderson. I'm a student here at Rutgers. Mr. Bodman, you mentioned that the Republicans win when the Democrats screw up. How could Murphy's campaign screw up and lose the election?
We'll have to get in office to screw up first. So, no, seriously, I was talking about if you look at the three Republicans that were elected in modern time, three Republican governors. Governor Kane, the race I ran back in 1981, was an open seat. Byrne was at the end of his second term, was term limited, so it was an open seat governorship. Governor Kane won by exactly 1,797 votes. It's a number that sticks in my head for the last 40-odd years. It was the closest gubernatorial election in state's history. 4 years later, by the way, he won by 800,000 votes, which is the biggest landslide in state's history. I mentioned I was with him the other day, the governor, and he politely reminds me every time I see him. When you ran my campaign, and the other guy, Governor, I actually remember that little fact, thank you. Anyway, the next two time out was the Florio election with Whitman in '93. Now, Karen mentioned that point, that Florio raised a lot of taxes. Florio free in '93 was the phrase, and bumper stickers, and back when we had cars with antennas on them, there was a lot of toilet paper on those antennas because they extended the sales tax to toilet paper and things like that. Hands across New Jersey. Somebody remember all this stuff? Anyway, so he was a one-term governor, and Whitman won by only about 25,000 votes, I might add. Fast forward to 2009. Somewhat the same situation with Corasaniti. The Democrats raised taxes. They actually shut the state down in 2006 or 7, if I recall, because they couldn't. They were fighting over which tax to raise. And the tax they ultimately raised was the sales tax from 6 to 7%. Of course, on the promise that half of that money would go to reduce your property taxes, folks. I'm sure you all got those reductions. Anyway, and the economy was in the tank and all that kind of stuff. So, Christie was a perfect candidate for 2009. A tough talking, federal prosecutor, corruption-busting prosecutor, come in here and I'll whip this state into shape. That was the gist of it. So the point I'm trying to make is that you had one open seat governor that was very close, and it was a very different world in 1981 demographically and politically. But by '93, Democrat Florio, and 09 Corzine, neither could win re-election based upon their records.
I do wonder, Roger, though, if when you mentioned the demographic shift, Corzine lost, but that was the global economic crisis certainly played a role in that.
Yeah.
And you've got to wonder if that hadn't happened, I think he probably could have won re-election.
Agreed.
But New Jersey, it's both the Republican Party has shifted so far to the right, and New Jersey demographically keeps getting more and more Democratic. I don't know if that's, if that sort of law of the New Jersey disgruntled, anti-tax voter is. I mean, it may well hold. That's like we said, off-year elections, make that a little easier to happen. But I don't know. The way the Republican Party has gone and the way this state has gone, they've just gone completely divergent.
And Matt, I am very much of a dying breed. I am a Tom Kean Republican, that moderate republicanism that is dying by the second. Sadly, I started my career as a driver to a wonderful woman named Millicent Fenwick. And I had two mentors. Millicent Fenwick and Tom Kean, and
Rhino.
I couldn't ask for Sorry. Anyway, the point being that I think Guadagno is as Millie pointed out, she's running as a moderate. You listen to her speech. She is of the Tom Kean vein. She may too be a dying breed in the Republican Party, but it's a very different than the two nominees that ran in '89 and in 2001. I pointed out that a Republican governor never succeeded another, but you have to look at the nominees that tried to succeed them. Jim Courter in 1989 was a friend of mine. I was his chief of staff when he was a member of Congress many, many years ago. Was a very right-wing, or certainly conservative, actor from Northwest New Jersey. He just didn't fit the state very well. And Brett Schundler, who was the candidate in 2001, even more so. These folks, with all due respect to both of them, really didn't fit the middle-of-the-road aspect that New Jersey voters like to vote for. And, we'll see whether Guadagno does, but she's certainly much more in the vein of a moderate than the two predecessors that were defeated in the elections after the two previous Republican governors left office.
I think, Roger, but remember that she may decide that she's going to run a campaign as a moderate, but she has to be able to demonstrate and define what her record has been to be able to then prove that she's that person and that
we're getting the campaign,
and she is that
right
candidate,
here. You're seeing it,
right?
Exactly.
Absolutely, and I think that's right, and I also think that this question of, and Matt spoke to this, or the GOP party, and to the extent that it has moved to the right, this is Millie Silva speaking, in my opinion, the party is doing that at the risk of losing many moderate Republicans who see what is happening in the state with regards to the economy, with regards to the issues that are important to them. And that's going to be an issue that may play out in November, when you also recognize that at this moment, we're going to be running a race, right, where there's an intersection between what's happening with national politics, what's happening in D.C., as well as what's going to happen here in New Jersey. So one of the issues that we haven't talked about is health care and Medicaid, right? When you take a look at what has happened over the course of the last few weeks, with the conversations, with the town hall meetings where our congressional delegation and what are the positions that they've taken with regards to the Affordable Care Act, there are a lot of New Jerseyans, many of whom are first time getting involved, who are saying, I'm going to come out to a town hall meeting. I may be a person who's going to hold a sign in protest and say, if you are threatening to take away my health insurance or not make sure that I have access to it, I'm going to be a part of speaking up and resisting. And so that engagement is something that is also going to play out, where you're going to see how does Murphy, and I believe that he's already demonstrated this in terms of his campaign and his position on this, when he spoke last night and during the course of the campaign, he's taken a position to say he will be a part of an administration that's going to defend health care, make sure that Medicaid funding is something that is available and is accessible to people in New Jersey, right? And let's all remember, Medicaid pays for things like nursing home services, all right, in addition to basic health care needs for many people. And then the question becomes for the lieutenant governor, how does she then define how she's going to think about Affordable Care Act, how she's going to think about funding for Medicaid, how she's going to stand up on that issue, which is important to so many New Jerseyans, when the GOP congressional delegation here in her own state, our own state, is in some ways taking positions that are to the far right and not in sync with New Jersey voters.
One funny thing from the debates was that Michael Aaron asked both Kim Guadagno and Jack Ciattarelli whether they would welcome Donald Trump into campaign with them. They both gave a lukewarm, well, he's the president, and you always welcome the president, but neither of them would want him anywhere near here. But I just find it so amusing to think about it, to think Donald Trump knows this election is going to be red, right or wrong, as a referendum on him, can't you just imagine him really wanting to come here and just completely disregarding aide's advice to stay away? I mean, I'm just guessing, but I think that would be a pretty hilarious and awkward event.
Yes. There's a disappointed voter here I'd like to call on. Wait, get a microphone. Just
Why are you saying disappointed?
because of your shirt. I was the only
Well, I'm
reason.
actually one of the undecided voters.
Okay.
No, I'm actually, this is just a prop.
Okay. Yeah. Could you just introduce
What's a
yourself?
prop? I first want to ask Mr.
Could you
Bodman.
introduce yourself, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Mark Pepper. I live in West Windsor.
Hello, Mark.
Did you say Hopewell or Hopewell Barrow?
Hopewell Township.
Okay. Would you know Jean Harrington from Hopewell Barrow?
I'm afraid not.
We're good. Get to a question now or a comment.
Okay. All right. I'll skip. I'll talk to you later.
Okay.
All right. I'd like to talk more about the third party issue. Okay. Was John Anderson running as a third party during Jimmy Carter's first run for president or the second?
1980 when Reagan won.
1980. Okay. All right. So he had a huge. I guess he's the reason Reagan won because Jimmy Carter lost to. I think John Anderson had a pretty decent percentage of vote, if I recall correctly. I don't remember the number.
No, I think. Well, I don't know where we're going with this, but I think
Yeah.
he followed the path that Ryders said for Christie.
Right.
He was popular, and then as the election day got
Well,
closer,
ever since those days, people have been yearning for a third party. It just never happens. Okay. As you said, the Republican Party has shifted so far to the right. The Democratic Party has also shifted to the right. So all those Democrats on the left are saying bye-bye, and they're going third party. We saw that in 2000. That's how W won. Okay. So it's still happening. So under my blue shirt is a green shirt. So I need to be really convinced why I should. I have had friends since the 60s telling me, why am I still a Democrat? Begging me to just forget it already. And I need a good reason why I should stay in the blue party and not go to the green party. Because one of my primary desires is universal health care. And the only candidate in November who's going to be pushing for universal health care, I think, is the Green Party candidate, as far as I'm concerned, unless Phil Murphy decides to move more left and go for universal health care. So I could go on, but I'll stop there. We'll just cover that one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I really I think this is a really great forum. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Well, I think one reason, maybe just looking at it very practically, is if you unregister as a Democrat, you can't vote in the primaries. And when you have a yeah, you could go up and register that day, but you'd still be registered. So if single payer is your singular issue, and okay, the one that you said and that you're voting on. So if you want that, you find the candidate in the primary and you go vote there. I think this is why it kind of persists. Every time that there's a third party candidate who wants to get in, they miss out on all that media attention as well that goes into focusing on the two primaries. You saw it in the presidential as well. I'm forgetting the name of the Green Party candidate.
Jill Stein.
Jill Stein.
I think in general, the only way a third-party candidate could have any viability is if a state or the country adopted ranked choice voting. And the state of Maine, the voters just did that, and the court has declared it unconstitutional. So it's a heavy lift to get that to happen. But without that, I think it's a non-starter, basically. Beth?
From Morristown, New Jersey, League of Women Voters. And we all share, and the League is a major force in this, trying to raise the turnout both for primary elections and for the general election. What we're seeing, I think, is a rise in the number of unaffiliated voters who, yes, they can participate if they declare, but generally speaking, I'm interested in your opinion how going forward, because most of those unaffiliated voters are the younger voters, how that will affect the nomination process going forward, and what you see as how we can encourage more voters to participate in the system. But basically, with the rise in unaffiliated voters, how you see that affecting the process.
I think that goes to the heart of Jeff's question a little earlier, which is, and I had this article from the Ledger, which was appeared Monday, I think, where 2,048 registered Democrats, 1,209,009 registered Republicans, and 2.402 unaffiliated. Obviously, the unaffiliated being the largest category. I don't know. I don't have the answer to your question. I can just tell you a little story. It goes back to my teaching in this very room. At the end of those classes every year, I gave a little speech, and I'll give you the abbreviated version, not to take up too much time. It was an elective course. It was once a week in the fall semester. There was 50 students. Limited. I did it for 20 years, so therefore, 1,000 students went through this class in the 20 years I was here. And I, at the end of that class, gave them a little lecture. You students took this class for a reason, presumably. You didn't have to. It's an elective. It's on political campaigning. Therefore, we must have some small modicum of interest in politics, I would guess. That's why you're here. So therefore, get involved. I don't care, I'd said, whether you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're a liberal, you're conservative, get involved. My father was on the planning board in my hometown of Bernardsville for most of the 1960s. That was his way of giving back. Came home from commuting to New York got home at 7 o'clock at night, left at 7:30 for, once a week or once a month or whatever it was for his planning board meeting. Do something like that. Get involved in politics in some way, shape, or form. And many of those students, as many alumni of Eagleton, in fact, do. The second thing I said to him, by the way, while I'm on my high horse here, was that the only thing I asked him to do, pleaded literally, was, disagree agreeably. Let's have some decent political discourse. And I quoted the then Republican nominee of 1996, Senator Bob Dole, who said about President Bill Clinton, "He is my opponent, he's not my enemy." Please keep that in mind.
I do think there's one other thing to the turnout. It's kind of goes along with what he was just saying. After the 2016 election, while there was obviously like a big hunger for change in the Democratic Party, there was also a massive surge in the people interested in running in very local school board elections and everything. I did a story focusing on what Emily's List had seen, and throughout all of 2016, with Hillary Clinton at the top of the ticket, they had 8,000 people reach out to them and say, "Hey, we would like to run." In the 4 months or 3 months after Donald Trump was elected, they had over 100,000. And you saw that at Emily's List. You saw that here at Rutgers, which at the Ready to Run program, which is another part of that story. So I think at the same time that we're struggling to maybe get turnout up, you also are seeing some new energy in terms of civic engagement, in terms of running for office that you might not have seen. That's smaller numbers overall, but a big percentage increase.
I think that's right. And one of the issues is also that, there's conversation. I am not a millennial. I know that. But one of the things that, because the conversation sort of comes up about how to engage younger voters or young adults or millennials, I think that one of the things that has to fundamentally shift is this view that folks who are younger don't know what is going on around them, are not willing to get involved, and are not engaged. And I think that if both the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party, if the mindset is one where we have to then sort of say to people, you got to get involved, and you don't know what's going on, and you need to be informed. I have a teenage son. I know that if I don't ask him the question and I'm open to hearing what are the things that he cares about, he's not really going to care what it is that I have to say. And so I think that the parties as a whole, generationally, have to make a shift where they are open to actually asking young adults who are contributing to this economy, who are engaged in their communities, what are the issues that you care about? What are the things that you think are important to change here in the state of New Jersey, and to create space for them to participate and to lead? And I think that that's actually going to be critical for both of the parties in order to be able to sustain itself going forward. Absent that, then there will continue to be this dynamic where, part of the morning after is, how did the young voters do, and what do we think about them? And so I think it's something that, any opportunity I have, I certainly encourage that we are open to creating space for younger people because they are here and they are engaged and they are active. And if we don't tap into that, then the parties are actually going to atrophy. So that's one of the things. And we have not talked about this, and I will take note as the only woman on the panel, that we have not had a conversation about the role of women, both in terms of the election, both in terms of turnout, and what this means that we now have, for the second time, a woman who is the nominee from the major party to run run for governor here in the state of New Jersey. So I'd be interested if we could maybe talk a little bit about that.
We're very proud of the fact that Governor Christy Todd Whitman was the first woman elected as governor of the state of New Jersey, and now hopefully Lieutenant Governor Guadagno will be the second.
I think, Nick, at least, you need to leave, right?
I do, I'm
I don't know
sorry.
if you, okay, so thank you so much for coming, but what? Well, I would only know that if I looked at my phone. Yeah, thanks so much for doing this. Thank you. Well, Millie, did you want to say something about what the topic you just brought up? Or?
You know, I mean, I do think that I asked it earlier, sort of raised the question. It will be interesting to see how the GOP does in terms of supporting the lieutenant governor in her campaign, and whether there, what does the support look like in terms of her being able to run her campaign. I think the question of how she defines herself is something that's going to be critical. And I also think that, some of the commentary that we've already seen in terms of the race at the moment, where I believe that there's a Hudson County official who referred to her campaign in the context of how it's great that she's running and that perhaps we need a mother's touch and that's what we need now, sort of raises that question again of how also, GOP leaders, right? How do we perceive women leaders who are running for office? And I think it's a question and a dialogue that I'm hoping continues to occur as we move forward over the next 5 months.
I want to direct a question to you, Millie, that came online. Whether you have advice for Murphy and Guadagno as they embark on their search for lieutenant governor candidate. Or if you have advice for maybe you might have advice for the people they approach as to whether.
Maybe she can answer that question. She's got a little experience in that department.
Yes.
I think that for anyone who leads any team, one of the things you want to do is that you make sure that you have someone by your side who stands as an equal in terms of their knowledge of the issues and in terms of their ability to help move and implement the program and the goals that you have, and someone who then you're also thinking towards the future and how to think about if you're successful in being elected, you then are creating an opportunity for other leaders to be able to perhaps continue the work after you are elected once, and if you win the support of New Jersey voters again, that you are reelected, so that you're looking at not 4 years down the road or 8 years down the road, but really thinking about 12 years down the road.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Wait for a microphone. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Mo. I go to Rutgers, and the question that I had we didn't talk about is the Virginia primary. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the Virginia primary. I know it said "and Virginia" too in the title.
Yes.
So if we could talk a little bit about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, the answer is I know absolutely nothing about the Virginia primary.
Tom Perriello, and I understand there was some stuff about Confederate monuments on the Republican side or something. That's all I know.
I think
I'm focused right here.
I do think that that's a race where, at least at this point, the Republicans have a better chance than they do in New Jersey, or more like, and that for Trump would be a big deal if, because the Democratic governor now was replaced by a Republican governor. But beyond that, we're not the right people. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. My question is...
Your name?
Oh, Mike Brown from East Brunswick. My question is a looking forward question. Do you see anything in this primary or in the upcoming gubernatorial election and how might that influence the 2018 makeup of the congressional Congress from New Jersey, congressional representatives?
I have to wonder about Jim Johnson. I thought had a very good campaign in a lot of ways. He came out, I mean, no one had heard of him. He had been involved in things, but on a very, kind of low-key level. He had been involved in panels on racial profiling. He had a, pretty powerful position in the Clinton administration back in the 90s. I wonder if Democrats will look to him for some sort of higher office, whether it was, running against Rodney Frelinghuysen. There's no shortage of candidates who want to do that. Or, perhaps even as a sort of counterweight to someone like Donald Norcross in South Jersey, let's say if Menendez has to leave the Senate for some reason. And I mean, there's going to be a lot of North Jersey political bosses who really will want anyone but Donald Norcross. Now, I mean, they have a pretty deep bench, but they might not want to run, another white guy. At the same time, Jim Johnson really ruffled some feathers. He went after Phil Murphy pretty aggressively and accused him of breaking the law and everything. So if Phil Murphy is governor, I don't know how, we don't know yet if Phil Murphy holds grudges the way some of our governors have held grudges.
I have no idea who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Hi, Lisa Allen from Summit. Thank you for mentioning, Lieutenant Governor Guadagno. I'm curious if women on the Democrat side would come out to support Kim because she is a woman. But separately, I would like to see some bipartisanship across the state. I interview people, a lot of politicians, and they all say we have the answers, and they all know what to do, and there's lots of bipartisanship happening on the pension side, but none of it has been implemented. And everybody knows the answers, but nobody wants to come around the table and really do the hard work and solve it.
I don't know if Ruth. I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure if everyone knows the answers, but
I'll answer. I hope some Democrats support Kim. She's certainly worthy of support.
yeah. Studies in past elections have shown that's not the case. That people, men and women, don't vote by gender, or at least women don't vote by gender. Ruth? Yeah.
On the data that we have going back decades now, there's just no evidence that, especially Democrats crossing over and voting for Republicans based on gender. There's no evidence. So if it happens, it's going to be a first.
It would be a good
historic first.
There's always time for a first.
Yes, right. We learned that last year. Yeah.
Voters are going to vote based on the issues, and I think that it's going to come down to ultimately people taking a look at Phil Murphy and his platform and his agenda and asking themselves, does this speak to the issues that are important to me, and do I believe that then with his leadership we can get New Jersey back on track? I think to your point around bipartisanship, I actually think it is critical that for some of the toughest issues that we face as a state as well as nationally, it is important that people are able to get to the table, to have the discussion and have the debate, because if anyone ever thinks that they have all the answers, then likely that person is the most wrong person in the room.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're going to have time for two more questions. Let me get you and you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Akin Ola. I'm from Bloomfield, New Jersey, and the American Federation of Teachers. I guess I'm curious to know what y'all would think about, I guess like an actual like Bernie-crat having been in the race, or like a further left politician, and if that would have impacted the race at all in terms of the Democratic primary.
So you don't believe John Wisniewski is an actual Bernie-crat?
No, I don't.
Yeah, you're right. Not really, especially if you're splitting the sort of progressive vote between 3 or 4 candidates. Ray Lesniak had a lot of, those positions. He got 5%. Jim Johnson actually was fairly vague in his positions and was second place. I don't know. I feel like, the progressive wing of the party often tends to be its own worst enemy in these things, and you could see it sort of splitting the vote up quite a bit.
Yes.
Should I stand up?
Yeah, stand up.
Hi, so I'm Kyle. I'm a student at Rutgers. I'm also from South Jersey, and I know that we talked a little bit earlier about how there's some moderate Republicans that would switch over to Democrats in New Jersey and how New Jersey's demographically becoming more Democratic, but Trump actually did better in New Jersey than Romney did. He lost by 14, Romney lost by 18, and a lot of that was South Jersey. There's a lot of Democrats down, especially in like Gloucester, Cumberland, Salem, that have switched over to the Republican Party, type of like Midwestern voters. And South Jersey also last night, neither Murphy nor Guadagno did as well in South Jersey as they did in the rest of the state. 3 of Chitterelli's counties that he won, Gloucester, Salem, and Burlington, are in South Jersey. Wisniewski won Salem and also almost won Ocean, interestingly enough. I think he got 35%. Murphy only got 37%. So both of these candidates didn't have a lot of appeal down there for whatever reason, at least compared to North Jersey. And I know it's not the bulk of the state's population, but how do you think the 2 candidates will reach out to that area?
Great question.
Well, let me try. There's a very real big difference between a primary election and a general election, obviously, and I wouldn't put a lot into the trends of how these candidates did there in this primary election. It's a family fight, and it's as we point out, it's also a very low turnout election. You know, it depends on the election turnout in the general election. My memory is a little hazy on this stuff, but when I ran Kane's campaign back in the early 80s, I think the gubernatorial turnout that year was in the 60%, low 60, 62, 63. I believe in the last election in 13, it was below 50. You may remember, Millie. I think it was below 50%. I think it was 48% or 47 in there. You know, so South Jersey could, depending on how it turns out and whether it turns out disproportionately higher than the remainder of the state, could obviously be a much bigger factor. But the real issue here is lower turnout across the board. It has a lot to do with political cynicism and so forth. I had a student in this class way back when that said to me early part of the course, my father said to me, "Why are you taking this class? All politicians are crooks." And I said, "Young lady, all politicians are not crooks. 99% of them, perhaps 99.9, are very good, decent, hard-working people that are in a very difficult job, regardless of your political philosophy and so forth." But that cynicism, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for it, which we don't have time to talk about today, but, I have my theories, is contributing to lower turnout. And it's something, the woman in the back from the League of Women Voters, I'm sure you're focused on this. How do you get people to turn out in an election in a very cynical world when our political discourse is so ugly?
It's true. I think, and the South Jersey thing is also, it's very much about class. And if you look at the 2016 results, Trump won districts that Obama won in South Jersey, like Tom MacArthur and Frank Lobiando's district. And in North Jersey, he lost Leonard Lance's district as a Republican district, and he barely won Rodney Frelinghuysen's district. So that's, North Jersey well-educated, wealthy districts versus South Jersey working class districts. But I don't.
They're well educated in South Jersey too, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
You're looking at that, but
just a thought.
Like the Midwest.
Well, I understand, but you're well educated in the Midwest too. Some of you, anyway.
So, well, there's, but I don't see, Guadagno's not Donald Trump. She's not running like Donald Trump, and I don't think she has the appeal that she has to those demographics. I'm more interested to see whether Trump remains popular there in 2018, and we're going to have a good test of that because we'll actually have two different candidates. You have Frank Lobiando, who's, even though he said he voted for Trump, he's been very careful to keep his distance from him. And voted against the health care bill, and Tom MacArthur, who salvaged the health care bill and is now having a fundraiser with Trump, I think, Friday? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of, he's in for a penny, in for a pound with Trump. So we'll actually have a test in 2018 about whether that was a fluke or whether, the South Jersey will remain, those districts will remain loyal to Trump. But I doubt it will really play out this year.
Millie, do you want the last word?
On this piece?
Any piece.
I mean, look, one of the things that's exciting about this election going into November is that every cycle we know that it is us and also Virginia who are going to be deciding who should be the governor of the state of New Jersey. We're in a unique position given what happened in the last election in November of 2016, right? And so in a lot of ways, while I think that history is important and sort of taking a look at the data, it really remains to be seen what is going to happen in November with regards to what ultimately voter turnout is going to be, what it looks like across the state, whether it's North Central or South Jersey in terms of the demographics and how folks get engaged. And I think that what we're going to now see is what happens when you have two campaigns. How successful are they at engaging with voters across the entire state, not taking any vote for granted, and running a campaign when I think that there is an expectation that people are going to want to hear where do you really stand on these issues and have more substance to that as opposed to just the rhetoric. So I think that if this morning after has been interesting, I actually am more looking forward to the morning after in November because I think that there will be a lot that we have to say and digest in terms of how things went. I know for us, you know, I represent 1199 healthcare workers. We're the largest healthcare local in the state, in the state and also in the country. And so for us looking at New Jersey, it's going to be about how our members are then participating and engaging in the process and encouraging other people to engage, to come out to vote, because that's going to be critical, because we do care about what happens in Virginia, what happens in other states. And certainly we are looking forward to, you know, seeing at our union, Phil Murphy become the governor of the state of New Jersey.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. You can leave your coat on the chair and come back in November. Thank you all. Thank you to the panel.